Okay, so it's 11 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for participating in today's environmental review webinar. The webinar is focused on historical preservation, section 106. Today's presenter is Jill Dolberg. Did I say that right?
You did.
Deputy State Historical Preservation Officer from History, Nebraska. If you have any questions during the presentation, please use the chat function in the lower right-hand corner and direct comments to me, Allison Cumbier, and I will relay your questions to Jill throughout the presentation. All participants will be muted during the presentation because we are doing a recording. You may have noticed, for some of you, that when you entered into this webinar, you entered in as Rebecca. So when you are writing your questions, just include your name in the chat box. And I'll turn it over to Jill.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for letting me do this and for joining us this morning. Those of you who were able to put your names in, it was fun to see some names that I've seen before and worked with. So I feel like I'm just chatting with friends today. Let's get started and talk about CDBG and the 106 process. Now, before I even get started, I want to tell you that I am no expert on CDBG. That's for the DED folks to know in and out. I just know what I've worked with you all on as projects have come before me. So if I get some CDBG facts wrong, you'll just have to forgive me. All right. So I have a bunch of very wordy slides, and my promise to you is that I'm going to try very hard not to just read them to you. But there are a few things that might get read just word for word. So the purpose of 106 is to make sure that federal agencies are taking into account the effects of their projects. And that could be any money that started out as federal. It doesn't necessarily have to be a project that I'm just working on with a federal agency directly. So often I will refer to DED or to you guys as designees of the federal agency. But one thing that's important is that this process is intended to give the public a voice, so that if there are things that may be affected that are eligible for or listed in the National Register of Historic Places, that the public gets to have some kind of input in how they might be affected. It doesn't necessarily, however, mean that preservation is the answer and that we're going to make you save something, or it's not going to stop a project from happening. It just means that we stop and talk about it a little bit. So, in theory, this is all a four-step process. However, you know, I could share with you an 11-page single-spaced horrible document that provides the regs for this program, and you don't want to read it, and I don't really want to read it any more than I have to either. But it comes down to you start a 106 review, you identify historic properties, you assess what the effects might be if there are historic properties, and then you try to resolve any adverse effects. Sometimes with these kinds of projects, since you're often doing a project with just one building, we pretty much expedite this with the form that you were sent yesterday. And many of you, since I recognize your names, will recognize that form. So it could be that we are initiating and identifying historic properties at the same time. That's why I say in theory. Also in theory, every single one of you would be qualified to work with historic properties and make decisions about eligibility and such, but that's why we tend to help you figure out if things are eligible or listed, because there just aren't enough qualified professional staff everywhere to do that. So we are always happy to help. So the first thing is to determine if there is an undertaking, and CDBG is often an undertaking. So I know that I have reviewed 4 different kinds of projects, the downtown revitalization projects, and those tend to take the most time and the most conversation. So I spend most of the time talking about this. But also there's owner-occupied rehabilitation projects, there's public work projects, and water and wastewater projects. So we'll talk about all of those a little bit. But first, let's talk about how we know if something is historic or not. For our purposes, historic means that a property, and it can be a building, a structure, an object, a site, or a group of any of those as a district. But for our purposes, it's that they are eligible for listing or are listed in the National Register of Historic Places. So in order to be eligible, a property has to be 50 years old or older. It has to tell a story, some kind of significant story about the broader patterns of American history or a person important to our history. And in truth, that can be a local story. It doesn't have to be that this is where George Washington slept, because we don't actually really care where he slept. And he pretty much never made it this far west. So we tell lots of stories about commerce and how our communities work economically in a commercial area, or we talk a lot about architectural significance. That's another area of significance. And then there's also this kind of hard to define category called likely to teach us something in the future, which we mostly use for archaeology, things that might be eligible for archaeology. And then the thing that, for the purposes of 106, I look at more than anything is historic integrity. Does the building look pretty much like it did when it was built, or has it changed so much over time that it's not really recognizable as a historic property? Basically, things can be old and not be historic because they've been changed so much. So I want to give you some visuals to explain what I mean by that. And these are not Nebraska examples. It's just way more fun to find pictures that won't offend my fellow Nebraskans. So this is a commercial building on the left that you can tell has a lot of historic features. It's all wood frame, and it has this great tower, and there's windows in it, and it has this lovely shingled detail along the main, in between the two floors, lots of windows, and I'm sure it didn't start out as a liquor store, but it ended up at one at some point. And then they decided, because I'm guessing the tower started leaking, to take off the cupola top and, I don't know, stucco the whole thing. You can definitely see that there is a historic form in there somewhere, but we sure wouldn't say it was eligible now because we wouldn't have much that we could describe. So this is something where if you sent me this picture, I would say, wow, that's interesting. Go ahead and do what you want to do. And then this is to remind me to tell you that changes can become historic over time. This is a picture of a bank in 1908, and you can tell it's got all this great historical detail up in the cornice and these beautiful pilasters with capitals at the top, this gorgeous entrance. And you can see this still has this retractable awning. The windows are, of course, still historic. You know, it looks like it did when it was built, because that was probably right around when it was built. And then by 1940, they were looking for a more sleek look. It's still a bank, which is nice, but they took the, well, they covered up, I think, all of the historic details with these panels and created sort of a streamlined, modern look to it with this actually really beautiful entrance. And so we would say that that was now historic. It's certainly 50 years old or older, and so the change in itself has become significant. Whoops. But then somebody rehabilitated it in 2008, and I think they thought they were restoring it because they took off those panels, and there's still some historic windows and stuff and some of the detail from the cornice, but it's not all there because some of it had been removed. So it's kind of now just sort of a hodgepodge, a little bit of a Frankenstein. And these awnings are kind of distracting. You'll see partially just the shape of them is a little distracting. So this isn't what we would hope a project would look like if we were to use some CDBG funds to change things up. So just a couple examples to give you an idea. Later I have some house ones too. So let's stop there and see if there are any questions that I can answer for you about how we determine if something's historic. Feel free to type them in the message bar. Otherwise, I'll keep talking about historic stuff. The thing that you can always do is give us a call and we'll talk through it. You could email us some photographs in advance so that we can give you some thoughts about what kinds of features you might want to retain or what we consider the most significant features. Basically, talk to us anytime you like. We are happy to work through it with you. All right. Seeing no questions, I'll go on. All right.
One.
Oh, wait, we have one.
So, what does the process look like to list a building in the historic register in order to qualify for historic tax credits?
Oh, that's a great question. I have a colleague named David Calise who is in charge of the National Register program. And we like to think that if, for one program, we say that a property is eligible, that we would consider it eligible for a listing. There's an application that is a little complicated but not impossible, and we try to help you navigate that, although sometimes property owners just don't feel like they're prepared to commit to writing something like that. So we have lists of consultants that you could work with. Part of it is just that it takes time because we have, once we have a completed nomination, which can take a little bit of time to write, we submit it to our state review board, which is a group of about a dozen people who are interested in history and Nebraska history and architecture, and they review nominations for completeness and make recommendations about sending them to the National Park Service. Ultimately, it's a National Park Service program that we administer within the state, so they get the final say. That board only meets 3 times a year, generally in January, May, and October. So some of it's just waiting for the next meeting to come around. But then once it's been approved by the state board, it goes to the Park Service, and they have 45 days to respond. So it's kind of a hurry up and wait, and then wait again. So if you have an inkling that someone wants to take advantage of both the CDBG project and a tax credit project, we would recommend getting started with a National Register nomination ASAP, just to keep it moving. Sometimes, if the property is in a certified local government, they can make it a local landmark, which is a much shorter process, and then they're eligible for the state tax credit anyway. If they want to do the federal, they would still have to work on getting National Register listed. But they can all work together really well.
Okay. Next question.
Oh.
If a community is working on a FEMA residential flood buyout application, what are SHPO's expectations?
Oh, same kinds of things. So you can submit that form with some photographs of the property, and we'll sign off on it exactly the same way we do with CDBG. I have worked with some where they're doing a lot of buyback. I assume that's what we're talking about, the buyback program. And sometimes I just have somebody send me an address, a location, and the photo, and then they've got 20 of them or something. So we can find a way to make it a little easier than one form each if it's the same program over and over again. So you might just call me, and we'll talk it through.
Okay. Next question. When a building is on the list for an event that was inside the building, is that designation lost during an interior remodel?
Oh, not necessarily. I mean, not everything about a historic building is significant. So, and we anticipate that some things will change with time. I mean, when a bathroom or a kitchen fails to serve its purpose, you have to replace the things that don't work anymore. So, we would just work with them to see if we can retain the things that do matter, and that could be a stairway or the woodwork around the doorways or the windows, things like that. The hardwood floors, the pressed-in ceiling. Sometimes you can really tell the things that are there that we'd like to stay and some things that we don't mind,
Okay, that looks like all the questions.
All right, good questions, people. I'm impressed. Okay, so for downtown revitalization projects, I thought I would talk to you a little bit about what kinds of things we consider and what we expect historic buildings to look like, so that you have an idea what we might say when you come to us with a plan. So the first thing that we're going to look at is this building, or does the community have a historic district, a commercial historic district? There are a whole bunch, and I have a slide with just a list of cities that have historic districts. So if it is a contributing property in a historic district, that's as good as being listed individually, and so we'll say automatically that it's historic, because it is, and we're going to want to know more about your plans. If it happens to be in a building that we don't find to be historic, then we're not going to really care what you do to it. So sometimes if you know it's a really messed up building from a historical perspective, that sounds terrible, but truthfully, if it's changed a great deal and it's not in a historic district at all, this may be a really easy process. But whenever it does have some historic integrity, we're going to look at the things that are still original and try to maintain those features, repairing where we can. Whoops, oh gosh, I'm going backwards. This is a very sensitive mouse, pardon me. And then if there are things that have already changed, then those are some things that can change again with not the biggest amount of input from us. So every project is very different because it has a whole different set of variables to consider. So that's why we just spend a lot of time talking, communicating. So, as I say, communication with us is really important. We have a lot of information at our fingertips about historic properties throughout the state. We've got a survey of about 80,000 historic properties. We have maps, we have photographs from when they were surveyed last. We can tell you if something is listed already or if we think it's eligible. But the best part is that we can tell you what kinds of things we will want to see retained and what kinds of things just are non-issues. And the best part is that we can avoid somebody getting too far down the planning process without knowing what we're going to be thinking, so they don't have to start over. So here's the great big list of cities that have historic districts. We've got a wide variety. Some of them are single story, every single building is single story. Some of them have a lot of two-story or even higher buildings involved. Some of them have some historic theaters, as you can see, some great architectural details. Some of them are pretty simple, but there's lots of properties out there for us to work with, so I'm excited to work with all of them. So let's give you a little anatomy lesson. Starting from the top of a building. This is a pretty typical building that a lot of our buildings will fit into. Some of them may have more or less historic detail, depending on when they were built. If you look at buildings built in the 1880s through 1910, they all look pretty much like this. But the earlier ones will have more detail, and the later ones will get a little more simplified. So the top of the building is called the cornice, and that's where you usually have some decorative brickwork, but sometimes there's some pressed tin up there that we love to see retained or repaired. These are called window lintels or hoods, and if they're there, sometimes they're painted, but they're usually stone or cast concrete, and we like to see those retained if they're there. Sometimes they're also pressed tin. And then, of course, we're always looking at historic windows. This is called a storefront lintel, the space in between the two floors, and that's often a great place to put some signage. The windows above the big storefront windows are called transoms. And, I apologize. I'm having trouble with this wheel. I'll just stop touching it. So often those are covered up because they let too much light in. If they're there, sometimes they're prism glass, and we like to see that retained if we can. And then underneath, we've got the display windows. There's usually a recessed door. Sometimes it's been made flush. That might be a modern change, and we don't ask anybody to put that back, but we do like the look of a recessed door. And then at the bottom there's this base panel, or sometimes it's called a bulkhead, that it really just raises the glass up off the ground and makes sure that nobody's going to kick your window in. And it could be wood, it could be brick, it could be stone, it could be anything. So just giving you a few images. This is an older, far more ornate building with a great storefront, and some of those retractable awnings. Love that. This one I include just so you can see the difference between a recessed entry and the flush entry, and what a difference it makes in determining if something's historic or not. It really feels more historic if you've got this recessed entry. But you can also see this is a later building with not nearly as much ornate detail. It's usually just in the brickwork. And actually, that's pretty fancy. But one story and a little more simplified is usually about 1910 to 1920. And again, sometimes things change and the change becomes historic. So this is maybe one of the few examples I'm going to give of something that's actually in Nebraska. Burt's Drugs over here on the left is in Hastings, and it's in a very, let's say, 1900 building, but it has an extremely mid-century awesome storefront with the original neon signs, and it's very streamlined, modern, and oh, it makes my soul happy. And I think we're working on a National Register nomination just for this building, or no, we're working on a tax credit with this building. It's already listed in the National Register as part of the historic district. The buildings on the right are not from Nebraska, but are typical of things that we see. Sometimes they do things like this where it's just panels, and even though it's not very pretty, it certainly evokes an era. And so we would want to work with you to try to do something to maintain it, to freshen it up. But there could be some discussion there. And then you'll also find really commonly that the storefronts will change, and they'll install some aluminum windows in the mid-century and often angle things in a little bit differently from the way that central recessed entry that we often would see. This slide is just to, I'm not going to read this to you because it would be mean, but this is to remind me to tell you that we have a set of standards that we consider when we look at what we might like to do for a historic property. And it's called the Secretary of the Interior Standards, and when I sum it up in my mind, it is sort of like a doctor's Hippocratic oath, do no harm. We want to have things that are historic about the historic properties be retained, and if they need to be repaired, we do that. If they have to be replaced, then we try to replace in kind. There's a little more detail to it, and this is a very general list of things because it tries to be appropriate for all kinds of historic properties, which is a tall order, and I'm glad I didn't have to try to write them. So these are available online, and you'll also have access to this presentation, so you can look them up if you like. So here's some common facade projects and some more appropriate ways to do things that are commonly sought in CDBG. So let's say they want some new signage. Well, on the left you'll see, like I said, that storefront lintel makes a great place to put signage, but so do the windows themselves. That new vinyl stickum stuff is a really great way to use a window to advertise a store or a building. And I think it kind of harkens back to, oh gosh, if you look at some historic photographs of Lincoln or any other place, you'll see doctor's offices or dental offices on second stories advertising with their windows and with paint usually, but I think it's kind of a fun look. You could also use an awning to advertise a store or business. Just putting it on the edge of the awning is kind of a nice look. And then maybe even kind of an older look is to have that perpendicular sign sticking out from the facade. There might be some sign ordinances, though, in the communities that you're working with that you'll have to take into account, because some of them don't like that anymore. But it's a look. What can I say? It's a look I like. These are a couple examples that are a little less attractive from a historic preservation perspective. They're a bit big, which I suppose would appeal in some way, although I think a big reputation does more than a big sign to bring people in. So with the one on the left, we're covering up a bit too much window, I would say. With the one on the right, the upper story windows have been blocked, and it could be that that's a historic change, and we wouldn't ask them to change anything about that. But if they were wanting to cover up windows to put up a big sign, we would probably say that wasn't a great solution. We often see that people want to do some awnings. We have a fondness for flat awnings, and a lot of times people think those look a little bit too plain, I think. But a lot of times they have some pretty amazing detail, too. Sometimes we see people want to cover up the transom, and I think that's not a terrible thing. It can certainly be done, but we wouldn't want to cover up too much, including that lintel. It somehow just takes over the facade. And I think what we're seeing on the right is that there's sort of a nice look with keeping the awning within the frame of the window. So you're just covering the window, not the outsides of the windows, that kind of thing. So here's a few inappropriate ones. Somehow these domed ones always make me think of Brooklyn or something, where you have some walkway underneath to get into a restaurant. But they just aren't a shape that was prevalent during the historic period, and so not something we would recommend. And here's how it looks when we have them covering more than just the window, and it takes over a little bit. It's just a little bit too much awning. Whoops. So, things to consider about awnings. And then in terms of storefront changes, if you have a perfectly historic storefront, we wouldn't want to see closing it in on the first floor, because it's just not a look that is super appropriate. Sometimes I'll find that the project is about a property that already looks like this, and again, I don't have any authority to make anybody take something back in time, but if they wanted to roll it back, I would be happy to work with them on how that might be done and what it might have looked like. The same for the upper story here. It's not something we would want CDBG funding to do, but it is something that we could change using CDBG money. So, and also, if the windows are needed to change, we're going to want to keep them within the same framework and the same configuration as the existing, if we can, and if we can repair the original window frames, all the better. But sometimes they're just not big enough to hold the glass that we want for thermal breakage. So, yeah, you know, we work it through together. And then this is just to give you an idea of the upper story windows and what we like to see or not see. Sometimes people brick in windows and then leave the lintels, and that just makes us a little bit sad. Or they block them in with wood panels or siding or something like that, or they cover up the whole thing. In general, what we want to see is that the windows, even if they're going to be replaced, fill the opening that they had originally and aren't shrunken up or closed up completely. So, again, we work with you. All right. And then a word about paint. We don't get very involved in paint colors or anything like that, but we do want to emphasize that painting masonry that has not already been painted is not a great idea in terms of taking on a maintenance problem that you wouldn't have had before, because paint fails and eventually it'll have to be repainted again. Whereas if you just leave brick as brick, you can focus on all the other things that go wrong with buildings, because there's always something. All right. So just to sum up, as you look at the historic building that people are wanting to work on, historic or not, I guess, truthfully, look for the features that are historic, like the windows, the storefront, the transoms, any ornamentation, if there are existing canopies or awnings, are the alterations significant or not? You know, what kinds of, just to try to anticipate the kinds of questions that we're going to ask, because the more you come to us with, as we discuss plans for the building, the better we can help you work towards a plan. So, this is where I would normally ask if you have questions, but I think we're having a little trouble. Oh, is it all fixed?
Yeah, we can take questions.
Oh, well, fantastic. All right. So our technical difficulties are at an end. Does anybody have any questions so far about downtown revitalization projects? I have been known to schedule a trip out, if, particularly if it's a community that has a historic district already or has one that we think is eligible. Sometimes it's nice to schedule a day where I just walk around from building to building of people who are property owners who are thinking about doing a project and talk it through with them in person so that hopefully they know what to expect and frankly so does the CDBG person. That works out pretty well. There are, however, I think, 30-some communities that are getting CDBG money this year? I think so. So, you know, I guess be the first to call. I don't know that I can commit to 30 communities, but we can talk about me making a road trip or sending staff out. It doesn't necessarily have to be me. So no questions?
Give it like another minute because people have to type them.
Oh, well, good point. Yeah. I'm trying to think where I've done those kinds of meetings that have worked really well. Sometimes I have done some meetings where people can come and then we meet with people afterwards and I give a little talk. But I think it honestly works better just to have me meet individually with people and kind of run through why I get to be involved in their lives because otherwise they have a hard time understanding why I should get a vote in what they do to their properties. So.
Doesn't look like we have any questions.
All right, great. So for a lot of you, I hear from you with owner-occupied rehab projects. Again, the things I look for is the property in a historic district. If so, does it contribute to the district? Because sometimes there's things that are not eligible within the boundaries of a district. So those properties we don't care so much about unless the change will have some impact on the district as a whole. And if not, is it individually eligible? And again, here we're going to look at historic integrity. Does it look pretty much like it did when it was built? We look at siding and the porches. Are they enclosed or are they original? Are the windows original? That kind of thing. So a few examples. This is a house, I have no idea where it was, somewhere in the country, that was photographed one year and then somebody put a big old addition on it. So this is just a cute little bungalow we would survey and maybe say was eligible, maybe not. But with this addition, boy, we would sure not say that it is eligible now because it has changed so significantly. Important to note that for obvious reasons, the number of houses within our communities is higher than any other kind of historic properties or properties of any kind, really, historic or not. And so we hold them to a pretty high standard. I hate to say that it takes quite a lot for us to say, oh yeah, this house in the middle of Lincoln or Omaha or anywhere is eligible while all the others are not. So a lot of times we don't end up having to talk about these properties very much. Now, if you send me a picture with the house on the left and it all looks original, like it was built, and you want to do a project, this is one we would want to talk about. But those aren't typically the kinds of houses we see in owner-occupied rehabs. But you'll notice on the right, it's been changed a lot since it was originally built. It's lost the turret, and it's lost this little, I don't know what to call it. It's sort of a turret, but sort of not. The porch has changed fundamentally. That was a pretty common thing, that would happen because it takes a lot of effort to keep a spindly porch like that, all that woodwork from rotting. And, by the 30s, usually 50 years in, somebody has decided, I am not painting this one more time. So you end up with a different kind of porch column, like you see on the right. And then in this case, they've enclosed it. So really, we wouldn't say that was historic anymore. But you can also see it's been sided, and it kind of looks like those windows are too small for their openings on the side, but it's hard to tell. So we have far fewer cities that have residential historic districts, partly because we've been trying to make as many commercial historic districts as we can, because then they'd be eligible for some tax credits. There aren't any tax credits that help single-family homes from a historic perspective. There is a valuation incentive program that we can work with people on, though, if a property is eligible. But anyway, so not too many historic districts to navigate, but still. So this is a fairly typical example of a project that I would see. So if this is an owner-occupied rehab, is it an undertaking? Yes. In this case, this is a weatherization program project under the Department of Energy. Is it a historic property? No. It might be old, but it's kind of hard to tell under all of that siding, and it doesn't have a porch. And if there ever were historic details, they're gone. So it's actually hard to even pinpoint when this building might have been constructed, because there's just not enough to go on there. So this is pretty much a representation of about 95% of the houses that we see. So we sign off on these pretty readily and get them right back to you. All right. Occasionally I see infrastructure or public works projects. The most important thing I'm going to wonder about it is it in a historic district or an eligible historic district? Does it have any features like brick streets that we might want to talk about? We get pretty excited about brick streets because it's just not something we do anymore, but there's something really nice about them in their original environment. They do some natural traffic calming, which is good. You don't really want to speed on a brick street, but they can. And they actually last a really long time. I've been amazed. Like, they'll last 100 years. But if they heave at all, they get to be kind of scary for pedestrians, and they take quite a bit of maintenance. So we get it. But otherwise, if a city wants to change their sidewalks, I don't get too excited about it because they're something that have to change periodically. They break and crack and become hazards. Street lights, you might want to consider historic or period street lighting, but you might not. We'd get involved really if it was a historic district, and otherwise not at all, probably. But then there's all these, road surface things and water mains and all of that stuff that really can't be seen but is vital to the functioning of our cities. We're just not going to get in your way about. So this is just my reminder that there's more than a few things that can be included. Every once in a while, I'll see some kind of really fancy textured concrete and dyed concrete and things that don't last very well. Sometimes I'll see planters and like sidewalk furniture, I think of it, like benches and other things. And I don't get too involved in that kind of thing because I figure they can be easily changed. But I would remind you that if you have a planter, then someone has to keep it nice. And that is often what I see not working out for people when they put in extensive planters. So it doesn't have much to do with historical stuff, but I mention it a lot to people. Whoop. All right. For water and wastewater projects, usually what we see are brand new facilities being built somewhere in an open space outside of town. So in that case, we're looking at something completely different. We're not looking at are there standing structures that we need to work around? If there are, they're likely to go. But what we're going to be curious about is if there's a chance that there's any archaeology buried there. Sometimes you'll see we'll make a recommendation that we need an archaeological survey. We can help you find people who can do that for you. But the idea is we don't know where it is. We can make guesses based on what we have found, or archaeologists can, and I have a couple on staff. But sometimes you just have to make sure that there's nothing there before you do anything. So if you're going to start clearing land and it's never been cleared before, definitely we're going to want to talk about that a little bit. So, and that's my cue to remember that it is often important for us to communicate with CIPOs, or I should say for you all to consult with CIPOs, Tribal Historic Preservation Offices. There are a number of tribes. Okay, we know we have 4 tribes that are local to Nebraska, but we also have a number of tribes that have an interest in Nebraska because it's their historically land associated with their tribes. And so if you're doing something out in the open like that, you'll want to for sure invite them to consult. They have the same requirements to respond within 30 days that we do, but they also get, let's say they get as many reviews as we get in a month, which might be 350 to 500. They might not respond to you at all because they have far smaller staffs. So luckily for projects like this, non-response within 30 days, or at the end of 30 days, is also a finding that they're not interested to comment. So typically we try to respond within 5 or less, just because otherwise they build up. So do remember that tribes are sovereign entities, and so communication with them should come from a chief elected official like a mayor or a county commissioner, I guess, if it's a county project. It really shouldn't come from, the secretary of I don't know, some board. It should be somebody who is an elected official. So how about questions about those kinds of things? The other thing you might note, like all of Thurston County is a reservation for the Omaha. I might be simplifying that, but basically. So if there's a community within the confines of a reservation, you might want to consult with them about anything with standing structures as well. It's not just archaeology that they have an interest in. Y'all are quiet. Oh.
If you are consulting on a project, should you communicate through an elected official as well when working with CIPO?
Yes, I would say so. I think when you invite them to consult, that should come from an elected official. If they opt in on consultation, then they're going to end up working with you more directly. But that initial contact should definitely be an elected official.
Any other questions?
All right. Feel free to keep typing, but we'll keep going. So one of the forms that I sent you was the Section 106 review form that we've created, and it looks much like this. The other thing that I sent you was a flow chart that might be helpful for making decisions about when you're done. It gives you a visual for knowing how to navigate, sort of if this, then that. So, but I'm going to also try to to do that verbally here. So if you have a property and you need to initiate consultation with us, the best way to start is to fill out this form, save it as whatever you want, and email it to us. Our email address is hn.hp@nebraska.gov. You can send it to me. You can send one to whoever has responded to you in the past. Usually it'll all work out. If you don't hear from us within a week, you could reach out again because sometimes things get lost or it doesn't send the way you think it did. So we're never sad if you want to confirm that we've received something. So we'll print it out, and it should come with some photographs so that we can see the property, and a small description of what the plans are for the property is helpful. Sometimes if it's, like, I'm going to give you a hint, if it's an OOR project, you don't have to get too into the details if you think there's a chance we're not going to think it's historic. You could just say that it's an owner-occupied rehab or minor rehabilitation or something. And then we can just follow up with you if we think it's historic and we want more detail. Maybe that will save you some time. You know, and the truth, that's true of all these kinds of properties. If there's nothing historic there that, or if you don't think so, take a risk and we'll just ask for more information if we need it. You can also just send us a cover letter on letterhead with photographs attached. Make sure we have an address. That's always helpful. But the form makes it easiest because we usually respond the way that we've been communicated with. So we'll just email it right back to you as a PDF. But feel free to communicate with us early and often. That's my mantra. Early and often. Oh, this is too much information that's written down. But one thing I want you to know is if you're doing a whole bunch of downtown revitalization projects, we're going to need a separate form for every single property because otherwise it's way too confusing. If your project involves something like an infrastructure project where there's a lot of facets to it, but it's stuff like a new water main and we're going to redo the street and we're not changing the curbing or anything like that, or, you know, whatever it might be, I don't get too worried about those. You could do that all in one form, and I'll ask for more information if I need it. But you could also email it to me with some supporting documentation, like plans and maps and drawings and that kind of thing, just to make sure that we have what we need, but that's, in my mind, that's one project. And like I said, you can also have us come out and meet with property owners if you like. We can try to work that into the schedule. We are happy to travel because we like to say every day out of the office is a good day. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, as somebody else did, sometimes these projects might be combined with a federal and state tax credit project, and we would be happy to work with people on that. We don't really care, you know, they require a financial investment into a historic property, but we don't really care if the money comes from HUD or if it comes from their bank. So really this might be a way to kind of maximize a project for folks. Because there's a 20% federal credit and a 20% state credit on certified rehabilitation costs. So that adds up pretty fast. But the work might be investigated a little more thoroughly than for a 106 project. So they should be aware that they're going to care about everything that they do. So if we were to start at the beginning, let's say you have initiated the process with the submittal of that form. We're going to look at the photograph and determine if the property is already listed or if it's eligible for listing. And if it's not eligible, then we're going to give you a quick, no historic property is affected, sign off, scan it, and send it back to you. If it is eligible, then we're going to look a little more carefully at the plans and see if, try to anticipate what kinds of effect they would have on the historic property. That's where we might come back to you for more information. If it's going to be stuff like new HVAC, a new roof, insulation in the attic, things that don't really have an impact on what the building looks like, the historic nature of the building, then that in our minds is it's going to have an effect, but it's not an adverse effect. So it's a no adverse effect finding. If, however, there's a whole bunch of things that are going to happen, like window changes, storefront window changes, awnings. We're going to want to look at more carefully at the design for those things, and hopefully still get to a no adverse effect finding. But we might have recommendations about how those things should look, or what should be repaired rather than replaced. But if there is absolutely no way to avoid the adverse effect, then maybe we find a way to mitigate it in some other way. If we do find that we have an adverse effect and we mitigate it, we'll have to write some sort of an agreement document and file it with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, which is no big deal. I'll walk you through that at the time. It happens so infrequently, though, on these kinds of projects that I don't want to spend too much time on it for you. We can just leap off that bridge when it comes. So what kinds of things constitute an adverse effect? Well, anything that's going to cause physical destruction or damage. Moving a property to a new location, we would consider an adverse effect. A huge alteration. The building on the left is the Industrial Arts Building from the Innovation Campus, if some of you recognize it. The university did some good things there, but they took out all of this amazing structure that used to be in the building so that they could add on additional stories. And so if we were asked, and we were not, it wasn't actually a 106 project, we would have said that was an adverse effect just because it changed everything we said was eligible about it, even though the building is still there. And in this case, this is a demolition that's in process. So, and we get that sometimes buildings have to come down, you know. You can't neglect a building for 50 years and then expect it to still be redeemable. Sometimes they just aren't, or they could be if there was all the money in the world, which we know there is not. So, when we do have that adverse effect, we're supposed to avoid, minimize, or mitigate. So when we avoid or minimize, that's where we go back and forth about different alternatives that we could do to the plans that have been proposed. And sometimes we just have to mitigate, and I'll show you an example of that. We try to consider the alternatives, but sometimes it's a matter of finding a creative way to benefit the public in some other way. And again, once we have a resolution agreed upon, we write that memorandum of agreement or a programmatic agreement and file it. So this was a FEMA project way back in the day when the National Register listed Washington County Courthouse had hail damage. I don't know if you remember, maybe 5 years ago. But they had this wonderful press tin roofing that was not a great original design, because it turns out it allowed a lot of water in to undermine the structure. So it was especially vulnerable to that hail. So in this case, FEMA and the folks in Washington County found a company that was willing to take the damaged pieces and replace them in kind with the same material, but they fixed the problem that had caused the drainage problem to begin with. So in this case, this is going to be sort of rhetorical. I'm going to ask the question and then answer it myself. Would this be a no historic properties affected, an adverse effect, or a no adverse effect? Well, it's listed, so it can't be a no historic properties affected. And they put it back pretty much as it originally was, so it's not an adverse effect. We would call it a no adverse effect. In this case, action shot. The Rulo Missouri River Bridge was listed in the National Register of Historic Places, but the truth is bridges have a lifespan, and when they become unsafe, we really don't advocate for keeping them when they might fall into the river. So in this case, we knew it had to be replaced because of safety concerns. So in advance, we negotiated a memorandum of agreement that stipulated, among other things, that we would have the bridge recorded with measured drawings and photographs so that we would always have a record of what the thing looked like before it had to go. So maybe not the best outcome if you care a lot about historic bridges, but at the same time, the best outcome if you care about people driving across the bridge. Occasionally, we can find ways to to maintain them in place and save them for a pedestrian bridge or something like that, but sometimes those are held to just as high of standards as a traffic bridge, so it doesn't always work out. And this is my favorite, kind of project that has an adverse effect. So Pinnacle Bank called me and said, actually sent a review without calling me. If they'd called me, it might have helped them. That this former nightclub in Grand Island was going to turn into a Pinnacle Bank branch. And they just had no idea that I was going to say it was historic. And it turns out it was listed in the National Register as part of the Grand Island Historic District, and it contributes. And this is a very much changed facade that I was kind of surprised we said was contributing, but it was what it was. I had to say that that it was eligible because, it was already listed. So, meanwhile, they had already started taking the facade off of it before they ever reached out to me. So, I didn't really have a choice. It was technically going to be an adverse effect. For a moment, I thought I might be able to talk them into doing a tax credit project and restoring it, but that didn't work out. So, we agreed that it was going to have an adverse effect, although not in a judgmental way, because it needed to change anyway. And we came up with a way to mitigate by having Pinnacle Bank help fund the creation and the installation of these fantastic wayfinding totems for the Railside District. And I think people are really happy with them. They have maps and some historical information, and of course Pinnacle Bank's name gets to be on them, and so they look like wonderful, sponsors of the community. So it was kind of a win-win. And if you have more questions, I'm happy to answer them. This picture is Sassy Betty from like 1908, who was in a dance class, and I love her, so she's my totem. But here's my contact information, so you can email me or phone me if you like, although my phone is not working today, so don't call me today. And otherwise, does anybody have any questions?
Follow up to flood buyout question. On lots where buildings were demolished, will we have to do architectural surveys, or will photos work?
Oh, so they're already demolished? I would say send a photograph just showing me that that it's an empty lot now. I mean, there's nothing to really survey.
Archaeological survey.
Oh, archaeological survey. If you can show that it was a house before, I think we're going to understand that there's probably the archaeology, if they ran into any, it's been disturbed. So I would say no. We very rarely ask for archaeological survey within a town's confines because most of the land has already been disturbed in some way or another.
Any other questions?
Well, any feedback? Was this helpful? Have you learned things that will help you going forward?
Sometime later this week, I will be sending out a survey regarding whether or not this was helpful, if you have any trainings that you would like to see, or if you have any comments that you'd like to make or additional questions. But with that, we'll close. So thank you, Jill, for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.